The auction notice had been posted for 3 weeks, but Clara Whitmore still couldn't bring herself to believe it was real. Standing in the dusty yard of the Hartwell homestead, watching strangers poke through 50 years of accumulated life, she felt something cold settle in her chest like winter fog. The auctioneer's voice carried across the morning air, sharp and impersonal as he catalogued furniture, tools, and memories with equal indifference. Lot 47, oak dining table with 6 chairs, somewhere but still serviceable, he called out, and Clara watched the table where she'd eaten countless meals with old Mrs. Hartwell disappear into the crowd of bidders. The woman who'd raised her after her parents died in the influenza outbreak of '73 deserved better than this spectacle, but the county had rules about settling estates, and Clara's protest had fallen on deaf ears. She'd been working as a seamstress in town for the past 5 years, ever since Mrs. Hartwell's health had started failing, sending most of her earnings back to help with medicine and care. But it hadn't been enough. The debts had piled up like winter snow, and now everything had to go to satisfy the creditors. Clara had managed to scrape together enough to bid on a few small items. Mrs. Hartwell's sewing box, her Bible, maybe the quilt they'd worked on together during those long winter evenings. But the land, the house, the life she'd known, all of that would belong to strangers by sunset. "Ma'am?" A voice broke through her reverie, and she turned to find a tall man standing beside her, hat in his hands. He had the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors, with calloused hands and squint lines around his eyes from years of facing sun and wind. His clothes were clean but well-worn, practical rather than fancy, and something in his bearing suggested he was no stranger to hard work or hard times. "I'm sorry to bother you," he continued, his voice gentle despite its rough edges. "I'm Thomas Seaton. I understand you lived here with Mrs. Hartwell?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. The kindness in his tone threatened to break the careful composure she'd maintained all morning. "I knew her a little," he said. "Used to buy eggs from her when I was working the Morrison Ranch over the ridge. She was a good woman. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." The words came out barely above a whisper. Thomas glanced toward the house, where the auctioneer was directing men to carry out more furniture. "I was hoping to bid on the property itself. Got a small spread about 10 miles north, but I could use more grazing land. Thing is, I wanted to make sure." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Mrs. Hartwell mentioned once that you'd grown up here. If I were to buy the place, would you want to stay on? I mean, as hired help. I could use someone who knows the land, and it don't seem right to just turn you out." Clara stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You'd do that? Let me stay? If you wanted to. The house needs work, I can see that from here, but there's good bones to it. And the land's got potential if someone's willing to put in the effort." He met her eyes directly. "I lost my wife and baby boy to the fever 2 winters back. Been working other people's ranches since then, trying to save enough to start over. This place. It feels like it might be a good spot for new beginnings." Before Clara could respond, a commotion near the house caught their attention. 2 men had emerged from the back door, carrying what looked like tools and a crowbar. Behind them came the auctioneer, looking frustrated and animated as he gestured toward something inside. "What's all that about?" Thomas asked. Clara shook her head, confused. She'd lived in this house for nearly 20 years, knew every room and closet. But as they watched, more men disappeared inside, and the sound of hammering and prying echoed from within. "Folks," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying a note of excitement that hadn't been there before. "We're gonna have a brief delay while we investigate something that's just come to light. Seems there's a room in this house that's been sealed up tight for Lord knows how long. We need to get it open to catalog whatever's inside before we can proceed with the property sale." Clara felt her stomach drop. A sealed room? It wasn't possible. She knew every inch of this house, had cleaned and cared for it alongside Mrs. Hartwell for years. There wasn't any room that. But even as she thought it, she remembered something that had always puzzled her. The back hallway where the root cellar door stood had always seemed just a little too short. She'd noticed it years ago but had never thought much about it. Old houses had their quirks, their odd proportions from additions and changes over the decades. And Mrs. Hartwell had never mentioned anything about a sealed room. "Miss Whitmore?" Thomas's voice seemed to come from far away. "You look pale. You all right?" She managed to nod, though her mind was racing. Why would there be a sealed room? And why had Mrs. Hartwell never mentioned it? The woman had been like a mother to her, had shared stories about every corner of the property, every stick of furniture, every family tradition. Surely she would have said something about a hidden room. The crowd was pressing closer to the house now, drawn by the mystery like moths to flame. Clara found herself moving with them, Thomas at her side, until they stood near the back porch where the sounds of destruction were growing louder. "There?" someone called from inside. "Got it loose?" The hammering stopped, replaced by the creak of hinges that sounded like they hadn't moved in decades. Then came voices, muffled but urgent, and after a long moment, one of the men appeared in the doorway, his face pale beneath a coating of dust. "Mr. Peterson," he called to the auctioneer. "You're gonna want to see this." The crowd pressed forward, but Peterson held up his hands. "Now folks, let's keep some order here. This is still a legal proceeding and we need to do this proper. Everyone just hold your horses while we figure out what we're dealing with." But Clara couldn't hold her horses. This was her home, had been her home for 20 years, and if there were secrets hidden in its walls, she had a right to know what they were. Before anyone could stop her, she pushed through the crowd and climbed the porch steps. "Miss, you can't," Peterson started, but she was already at the door. "This is my home," she said firmly, using a tone she'd learned from Mrs. Hartwell herself. "Whatever's in there, I need to see it." The hallway looked just as she remembered, except for the jagged hole in the wall where the men had torn away wooden boards and plaster. Beyond the hole, she could see darkness and the edge of what looked like another doorway. The air that drifted out smelled of dust and time and something else, something that made her think of old paper and dried flowers. "Got a lantern," one of the men said, pushing past her with a lit lamp held high. The light penetrated the darkness, and Clara heard him draw in a sharp breath. "Well, I'll be damned." "Language," Peterson muttered, but he was pushing forward too, his own curiosity clearly overcoming his sense of propriety. Clara followed them into the hidden space, Thomas close behind her. The room was small, maybe 8 feet square, with no windows and walls lined with rough wooden shelves. But it was what filled those shelves that made everyone fall silent. Books. Dozens and dozens of books, more than Clara had ever seen in one place outside of the church library in town. But not just any books. These were carefully arranged, some bound in leather, others in cloth, some that looked like they might be journals or ledgers. And between the books, tucked into every available space, were papers. Letters tied with ribbon, documents folded and filed, daguerreotypes in small frames, and things that looked like they might be maps or drawings. "Lord have mercy," Thomas whispered beside her. "What is all this?" Clara reached for the nearest shelf, her hand trembling as she touched the spine of a book bound in faded blue cloth. The title was embossed in gold letters that had mostly worn away, but she could make out enough to see it was a collection of poetry. Beside it was what looked like a medical text, and next to that, a volume on agricultural techniques. "These books," she said, her voice barely audible. "Mrs. Hartwell always said she wished she had more books. Said her father believed too much reading made women uppity, so she never got much schooling. But all these books were here the whole time." She pulled one of the journals from the shelf, handling it like it might crumble at her touch. The leather cover was dark with age, and when she opened it, she saw pages covered in a feminine hand, the ink faded but still legible. "October 15, 1823, she read aloud. "Father says I must stop writing in this journal, that it serves no purpose for a woman to record her thoughts. He has threatened to burn it if he finds it again. But I cannot stop. Writing is the only way I can make sense of this world, the only way I can be truly myself. So I will hide it and all my other treasures in the space behind the root cellar wall. Perhaps someday when I am old and father is gone, I will break down this wall and reclaim the part of myself I am forced to hide. Clara's hands were shaking as she turned the pages. Entry after entry filled the journal, chronicles of a young woman's life, her thoughts and dreams and fears recorded in careful script. And not just one journal, there were dozens of them, years and years of hidden writing. Who wrote these? Thomas asked, reading over her shoulder. Clara flipped to the front of the journal, where a name was inscribed in the same careful hand. Property of Elizabeth Hartwell, age 16. Mrs. Hartwell, Clara breathed. These belonged to Mrs. Hartwell. But she was Elizabeth Morrison when I knew her. This must be from before she married. She looked around the room with new eyes, seeing not just a collection of hidden books and papers, but a young woman's rebellion against a world that wanted to silence her voice. There's more here, one of the other men called, pulling what looked like a wooden box from behind a stack of books. Feels heavy. Peterson had squeezed into the room now, his eyes wide as he took in the discovery. This changes things, he muttered. All of this needs to be catalogued, evaluated. Could be valuable, could be historically significant. We can't just auction it off without proper assessment. No, Clara said, and there was steel in her voice that surprised even her. These aren't just objects to be sold. These are Mrs. Hartwell's private writings, her personal things. She hid them for a reason. Now, Miss, Peterson started, but Clara cut him off. She was 16 when she started hiding these things. 16, and already her father was trying to control what she could read, what she could write, what she could think. She built this hiding place to protect the part of herself that nobody else understood. And now you want to put it all on auction blocks for strangers to paw through? The room had filled with people now, all trying to get a look at the mysterious contents. Clara felt overwhelmed, protective instincts she didn't know she possessed rising up like a fierce wind. These were Mrs. Hartwell's secrets, her most private thoughts, and treating them like commodities felt like a violation of everything the woman had meant to her. The law is the law, Peterson said, but he sounded less certain than before. This was part of the estate, and the estate has to be settled. Then I'll buy them. The voice came from behind Clara, and she turned to find Thomas stepping forward. Whatever the appraised value is, I'll match it. Consider it part of my bid for the property. You can't just, Peterson started. Why not? Thomas's voice was calm but firm. You said everything needed to be properly appraised anyway. So get your appraiser out here, figure out what it's all worth, and I'll pay it. Cash money, same as any other bidder. Clara stared at him, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. You do that? But you don't even know what's in here. It could be worth a fortune, or it could be worthless. Thomas met her eyes, and she saw something in his expression that made her chest feel warm despite the cool morning air. From what I can see, it's worth whatever it takes to keep it safe. Mrs. Hartwell went to a lot of trouble to protect these things. Seems like the least we can do is make sure they stay protected. The word "we" hung in the air between them, full of possibilities and promises that Clara didn't dare examine too closely. But she felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and fear that had been her constant companion for weeks. Well, Peterson said finally, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. This is highly irregular. I'll need to contact the county office, get an assessor out here. Might take a few days to sort this all out. Fine by me, Thomas said. Gives me time to get my affairs in order anyway. As the crowd began to disperse, disappointed that the mystery had turned into a bureaucratic delay, Clara found herself alone in the hidden room with Thomas. The lantern light flickered across the shelves of books and papers, creating dancing shadows that seemed to bring the space to life. Why? She asked quietly. Why would you do this for someone you barely know? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, running his fingers along the spine of one of the books. My wife used to write, he said finally. Nothing fancy, just little poems and stories. Her father burned all her writing when we got married, said it wasn't fitting for a wife to waste time on such foolishness. She never wrote another word after that, and I think something died in her when those pages went up in smoke." He looked at Clara directly, and she saw pain in his eyes that mirrored her own recent loss. "I can't bring Mary back, and I can't undo what her father did. But maybe I can make sure nobody else's words get destroyed just because some folks think women shouldn't have voices." Clara felt tears threaten for the first time all day, but they weren't entirely tears of sadness. "Mrs. Hartwell would have liked you," she said softly. "I hope so. I surely hope so." Outside, they could hear Peterson trying to restore order to the auction, announcing that the property sale would be postponed pending assessment of the discovered items. Most of the crowd seemed to be losing interest, drifting away to find other entertainment, but Clara noticed a few men lingering near the house, their expressions calculating rather than curious. "Thomas," she said, sudden unease creeping into her voice. "Some of those men don't look like they're here for the auction." He followed her gaze and his jaw tightened. "I see them. Been watching them myself. They showed up right after the sealed room was discovered, but they're not asking questions like the curious folks. They're studying the place like they're planning something." One of the men caught Clara's eye through the doorway and tipped his hat with an exaggerated politeness that made her skin crawl. There was something predatory in his smile, something that reminded her of wolves circling a wounded deer. "We need to secure this room," Thomas said quietly. "Tonight. Whatever Mrs. Hartwell was protecting, I get the feeling she had good reason to keep it hidden." Clara nodded, her earlier warmth replaced by a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The discovery of the hidden room had felt like a gift, a final treasure from the woman who'd raised her. But gifts, she was learning, sometimes came with dangers attached. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd thinned, Clara helped Thomas board up the opening to the hidden room, using lumber from the barn and nails they found in Mrs. Hartwell's tool shed. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would keep casual intruders out until they could figure out a better plan. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" Thomas asked as they finished hammering the last board into place. "I've been staying at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house in town," Clara said. "But I hate to leave this place unguarded. Those men you noticed, they might come back after dark." "I was thinking the same thing. Tell you what, I'll bed down in the barn tonight, keep an eye on things. And tomorrow, soon as the county office opens, I'll go file my intention to bid on the property. Might not stop someone from causing trouble, but it'll establish my legal interest in protecting what's here." Clara felt a mixture of gratitude and something else, something warmer and more complicated. "You're taking an awful risk for a stranger, Thomas Seaton." "Maybe we won't be strangers much longer," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him more closely. "I meant what I said about needing help if I buy this place. It's too much for one person to manage alone. And after what we found today, well, it seems like this land has stories to tell. Might be nice to have someone around who already knows some of them." As the sun began to set behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Clara walked with Thomas to the barn. He'd retrieved his horse and gear from where he'd left them that morning, and she watched him spread his bedroll in an empty stall with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making himself comfortable wherever he happened to be. "Thomas," she said as he was settling in for the night, "what if there's more to this than just a young woman hiding books from her father? What if Mrs. Hartwell sealed that room for some other reason?" He paused in his preparations and looked at her seriously. "What kind of other reason?" "I don't know. It's just, she never talked about her childhood much. Always said it was better to look forward than backward. And she never had any visitors from her family, never got letters from relatives. I always assumed they'd passed on or moved away, but what if there was more to it?" Thomas nodded slowly. "We'll find out, I reckon. Tomorrow when we start going through those papers properly. But whatever we find, we'll face it together. That's a promise." Clara felt something settle in her chest, a warmth that pushed back against the uncertainties and fears of the day. For the first time since Mrs. Hartwell's death, she didn't feel entirely alone in the world. As she walked back toward town in the gathering dusk, she turned once to look back at the homestead. A faint light glowed in the barn where Thomas was keeping watch, and somehow that small beacon made the whole place seem less vulnerable, less at the mercy of whatever shadows might be gathering. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, and probably new dangers. But for tonight, Mrs. Hartwell's secrets were safe, and Clara had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Someone willing to stand guard over the things that mattered most. The hidden room had been locked away for 50 years, but its opening had set in motion something that felt like the beginning of a story rather than the end of one. And as Clara made her way through the darkness toward town, she found herself thinking not about what had been lost, but about what might yet be found. Clara barely slept that night at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. Every creak of the old building, every sound from the street below, made her think of the homestead and wonder if Thomas was safe in the barn. She'd left him with Mrs. Hartwell's old shotgun and a promise to return first thing in the morning, but the memory of those calculating eyes watching the house kept her tossing and turning until dawn. She was dressed and walking toward the edge of town before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, her practical boots crunching through the frost that had settled overnight. October mornings in Colorado Territory could bite with winter's promise, and she pulled her shawl tighter as she hurried along the rutted road that led to the homestead. The sight that greeted her when she crested the small hill overlooking the property made her blood run cold. 3 horses were tied to the fence post near the house, and she could see men moving around the yard, not Thomas's careful, purposeful movements, but the quick, furtive actions of people who had no business being there. Clara broke into a run, her heart hammering against her ribs. Where was Thomas? The barn door stood open, and she could see no sign of him or his horse. Had something happened to him? Had those wolves she'd noticed yesterday come back under cover of darkness? "Thomas," she called out as she reached the yard, not caring who heard her. "Thomas, where are you?" One of the men near the house turned at her voice, and she recognized him as the one who'd tipped his hat yesterday. Up close, he looked even less pleasant, unshaven, with cold eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently twisted into a sneer. "Well, well," he said, walking toward her with a swagger that made her skin crawl. "If it ain't the little seamstress. Come to check on your property, have you?" "This isn't your property," Clara said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the fear coursing through her. "You have no right to be here." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, miss." The man pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and waved it in the air. "See, turns out the late Mrs. Hartwell had some debts she didn't tell nobody about. Legal debts with proper documentation. And when property goes up for auction, certain creditors get first claim on anything of value." Clara felt the ground seem to shift beneath her feet. "What debts? What are you talking about?" "Medical expenses mostly. Seems the old lady owed my employer quite a sum for services rendered over the past few years. Dr. Blackwood's been real patient about collecting, but now that she's passed, well?" He shrugged with false sympathy. "Business is business." The name hit Clara like a physical blow. Dr. Blackwood. She knew that name though she'd never met the man. Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned him a few times over the past year, always with a worried look and a quick change of subject. Clara had assumed he was just another doctor, maybe one who'd treated Mrs. Hartwell during one of her trips to the larger town 30 miles south. "Where's Thomas?" she demanded, looking past the man toward the house. "What have you done with him?" "Your friend? Oh, he's fine. Had a little chat with him earlier this morning. Seems he's been convinced to reconsider his bid on this property. Smart man, that one. Knew when he was outmatched." Clara didn't believe it. Thomas hadn't struck her as the type to back down from a fight, especially not after the promises he'd made yesterday. Something was wrong here, very wrong. "I want to see him," she said firmly. "Afraid that ain't possible. He had to get back to his own spread, tend to his own business." But he did leave you a message. The man's smile grew wider and more unpleasant. Said to tell you that some fights ain't worth fighting, and some secrets are better left buried. The words were wrong, all wrong. They didn't sound like anything Thomas would say, and they certainly didn't match the determination she'd seen in his eyes yesterday. Clara began backing toward the road, her mind racing. If these men had done something to Thomas, if they'd hurt him or worse, she needed help. She needed to get to town, find the sheriff, bring back people who could stand up to whatever was happening here. But before she could turn and run, another voice called out from the direction of the barn. "Clara. Thank God you're here." She spun around to see Thomas emerging from behind the building, leading his horse and looking thoroughly disheveled. Relief flooded through her, so intense it nearly buckled her knees. He was alive, he was walking, he appeared to be unharmed. But something in his expression warned her that the situation was far from resolved. "Thomas?" she breathed, starting toward him. "I thought." "I'm fine," he said quickly, but his eyes were hard as flint as he looked at the men in the yard. "But we need to talk. All of us." The man with the paper, Clara realized she still didn't know his name, turned to face Thomas with an expression of mock surprise. "Well now, Seaton. Thought you'd decided to head on home." "Changed my mind," Thomas said evenly. "Seems I got a few more questions that need answering before I go anywhere." He walked past the men with deliberate calm, taking a position beside Clara that felt protective without being obvious about it. "Clara, these gentlemen have been explaining to me about some debts Mrs. Hartwell supposedly owed. Funny thing is, the documentation they're showing seems a mite suspicious." "Suspicious how?" Clara asked, though she kept her voice low. Whatever was happening here, she sensed that open confrontation might not be the wisest course. "Well, for starters, most of these medical services were supposedly provided over the past 2 years. But I've been asking around town this morning, and nobody recalls Mrs. Hartwell ever mentioning this Dr. Blackwood. Strange, don't you think, for a woman to rack up substantial medical debts without ever talking about being sick?" The man with the papers, his companions had started moving closer, Clara noticed, laughed harshly. Maybe the old lady was embarrassed about her condition. Some ailments ain't fit for polite conversation. "Maybe," Thomas agreed. "Or maybe someone's been forging documents to create debts that never existed. Wouldn't be the first time someone tried to steal property through legal manipulation." The temperature in the yard seemed to drop several degrees. Clara could feel the tension coiling like a spring ready to snap. The 3 strangers had spread out slightly, she realized, positioning themselves to block the most direct routes of escape. This wasn't a legal proceeding, it was beginning to feel like a trap. "You're making some serious accusations, Seaton," the leader said, his voice losing its mocking tone and turning genuinely threatening. "Might want to be careful about throwing around words like forgery and theft. Could be dangerous for a man's health." "Could be," Thomas acknowledged. "But then again, so could trying to steal from a woman who's got friends willing to stand up for her." Clara felt a warm glow at his words, but it was quickly overshadowed by practical concern. "Thomas," she said quietly, "there are 3 of them and only 2 of us. And I don't think they're planning to settle this through legal channels." "No," he agreed, his hand moving slightly toward his coat where she suspected he carried a weapon. "I don't think they are either. Which is why I sent young Billy Patterson to town about an hour ago with a message for Sheriff Morrison." The leader's face darkened. "You did what?" "Sent for the law," Thomas said calmly. "Figured if these debts are legitimate, the sheriff can verify the documentation. And if they're not?" He shrugged. "Well, the sheriff deals with forgery and fraud same as any other crime." Clara bit back a smile. Thomas might look like a simple rancher, but he was clearly no fool. Calling for official help had been exactly the right move, and from the expressions on the strangers' faces, they knew it too. "You made a mistake, Seaton," the leader snarled. "Should have minded your own business and rode away when you had the chance." "Maybe," Thomas said. But I've got a powerful curiosity about what's really in that sealed room. See, I spent some time last night thinking about Mrs. Hartwell and her hidden books. Got me wondering, what if she wasn't just hiding poetry and journals? What if there was something else in there, something worth killing for? The words hung in the air like a challenge. Clara felt her breath catch as she realized what Thomas was implying. The hidden room contained more than just books and personal writings. There was something else, something valuable enough to attract the attention of men who were willing to forge legal documents and threaten violence to get their hands on it. "You don't know what you're messing with," one of the other men said, speaking for the first time. His voice carried a nervous edge that suggested Thomas had hit closer to the truth than they liked. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" Thomas replied. "What exactly did Mrs. Hartwell hide in that room that's got Dr. Blackwood so interested he's willing to send his boys out here with fake papers?" Before anyone could answer, the sound of hoofbeats came from the direction of town. Multiple horses moving fast. Clara felt hope surge in her chest. Help was coming. Thomas's message had gotten through. But the leader of the strangers didn't look concerned. If anything, his smile grew wider and more predatory. "Right on time," he murmured, and Clara's hope curdled into dread. The riders who crested the hill weren't wearing sheriff's badges. There were 6 of them, all armed, all looking like they'd be more at home in a saloon fight than a courtroom. Clara realized with growing horror that Thomas's message might never have reached the sheriff at all. "Expecting company?" Thomas asked, but his hand was now openly resting on his gun butt. "Just some business associates," the leader replied. "Dr. Blackwood likes to be thorough when he's collecting debts." The new arrivals spread out around the yard, effectively surrounding Clara and Thomas. 9 armed men against 2, and Clara wasn't even carrying a weapon. The odds had gone from bad to impossible in the space of a few heartbeats. "Now then," the leader continued, pulling a crowbar from his horse's saddle. "Let's go have a look at what the old lady was hiding, shall we? And don't even think about trying to stop us. This is all legal and proper, with documentation to prove it." Clara felt rage building in her chest, hot and bright as forged fire. These men were going to violate Mrs. Hartwell's sanctuary, rifle through her most private thoughts and treasures, and there wasn't anything she could do to stop them. The woman who'd raised her, who'd taught her to read and sew and stand up for herself, was going to be robbed even in death. "Over my dead body," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. The leader's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "That can be arranged, miss. But it ain't necessary. You just step aside, let us do our business, and nobody has to get hurt." "Clara," Thomas said quietly, "maybe we should?" "No." The word came out with such force that it surprised even her. "I won't let them do this. Mrs. Hartwell spent 50 years protecting whatever's in that room. I won't be the one to let it fall into the hands of thieves and murderers." Something shifted in the air around them. Clara could feel it, a change in the quality of the silence that made her skin prickle with awareness. Thomas felt it too. She could see him tense, his eyes scanning the edges of the yard. Then she heard it, the distant sound of more horses, but these were coming from a different direction. From the south, where the Morrison Ranch lay, and from the east, where several of the neighboring homesteads clustered around Willow Creek. The leader heard it too, his confident expression faltering for the first time. "What the hell?" The first group of riders came into view over the southern ridge. 5 men, all of them familiar faces from town and the surrounding ranches. Clara recognized Sam Morrison, whose family had been neighbors to the Hartwells for decades, and behind him rode Dr. Matthews, the town's legitimate physician, along with 3 other men she knew by sight if not by name. But they weren't alone. From the east came another group, and Clara's heart leaped as she recognized Sheriff Morrison himself at their head. Behind him rode what looked like half the men from town, all armed, all looking grimly determined. "Seems word got around," Thomas said, and Clara could hear the relief in his voice despite his attempt to sound casual. Amazing how fast news travels in a small community when something threatens one of their own. The leader of the strangers looked around wildly as more and more riders appeared from different directions. What had started as a 9-2 advantage was rapidly becoming something closer to 9 against 20, and the newcomers had the look of men who knew the country and weren't afraid to fight for what was right. "This ain't over," the leader snarled, but he was already backing toward his horse. "Dr. Blackwood's got legal claim to that property, and he'll get it one way or another. Then let him come himself and present his documentation to a proper court," Sheriff Morrison called out as he rode into the yard. "But if I catch any of you trespassing on this property again before the legal questions are settled, I'll arrest the lot of you for criminal conspiracy." The strangers mounted their horses with the quick, efficient movements of men who'd made hasty retreats before. But as their leader wheeled his horse toward the road, he fixed Clara with a stare that made her blood run cold. "This ain't finished, miss. Dr. Blackwood don't give up easy, and he's got resources you ain't even dreamed of. You might have won this round, but there's gonna be others." Then they were gone, galloping away toward the main road in a cloud of dust and the thunder of hoofbeats. Clara watched them disappear over the horizon, but the knot of fear in her stomach didn't ease. If anything, it tightened further. These men would be back, and next time they might not be content with legal threats and intimidation. "Clara, you all right?" Sheriff Morrison had dismounted and was walking toward her, his weathered face creased with concern. "Tom Patterson said you might be in trouble out here." "I'm fine, Sheriff. Thanks to Thomas and to all of you." She looked around at the assembled men, feeling overwhelmed by the show of support. "But I don't understand how you all knew to come." Sam Morrison stepped forward, removing his hat. "Word got around about what happened at the auction yesterday. About the sealed room and the strangers asking questions. Tom Patterson's boy Billy came to town this morning saying there was trouble brewing out here and well," he gestured at the assembled group. "Mrs. Hartwell was a good neighbor to all of us over the years. Seemed like the least we could do was return the favor." Dr. Matthews nodded agreement. "Besides, I've been practicing medicine in this territory for 15 years, and I never heard of any Dr. Blackwood. Any man claiming medical debts around here would have to go through me or Dr. Stevens in Millfield. Something about this whole business smells rotten." Clara felt tears threaten again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. She'd spent the morning feeling alone and outmatched, but now she realized that Mrs. Hartwell's kindness over the years had created a network of loyalty that extended far beyond the boundaries of the homestead. "What's this about a sealed room?" Sheriff Morrison asked. Billy wasn't real clear on the details. Thomas stepped forward. "Found a hidden space behind the root cellar wall yesterday during the auction. Full of books and papers that Mrs. Hartwell had been collecting and hiding for 50-odd years. Nothing that should attract the attention of armed men claiming medical debts, but those men seemed mighty interested in getting their hands on whatever's in there," Clara finished. "Interested enough to forge legal documents and threaten violence." The sheriff's expression grew grim. "Well then, I reckon we'd better take a look at what's got them so worked up. Mind if we examine this hidden room?" Clara felt a moment of hesitation. Mrs. Hartwell's journals and letters were intensely personal, and having a crowd of men paw through them felt like a violation of the woman's privacy. But then she remembered the predatory look in the stranger's eyes, the threat in his voice when he promised this wasn't over. Whatever Mrs. Hartwell had been protecting, it was clear that keeping it secret was no longer an option. "All right," she said finally. "But I want to be there when you open it. Whatever's inside, Mrs. Hartwell was like a mother to me. I have a right to know what she was hiding." The process of removing the boards Thomas had nailed over the opening took only a few minutes with so many willing hands to help. Soon the hidden room was accessible again, and Clara found herself standing at the threshold with Sheriff Morrison, Dr. Matthews, and Thomas while the other men waited respectfully outside. The room looked exactly as they'd left it yesterday, shelves lined with books and papers, the air thick with dust and the scent of old paper. But now, with the sheriff's lantern providing better light, Clara could see details that had escaped her notice before. "Look at this," Dr. Matthews said, pulling a leather-bound volume from one of the shelves. "This is a medical text on surgical techniques. Advanced stuff, much more sophisticated than most frontier doctors would have access to." Sheriff Morrison was examining another shelf, where several official-looking documents were filed between books. "These look like land deeds and property records. But not for this property, these are for holdings all over the territory." He pulled out a map and spread it on the small table in the center of the room. "Look at this. These marks show mines, water rights, grazing permits. This is a comprehensive survey of valuable assets throughout Colorado Territory." Clara felt her understanding of Mrs. Hartwell shift and expand. The woman she'd known as a simple homesteader had apparently been something much more complex. Someone who understood the political and economic forces shaping the territory, someone who'd been systematically documenting and mapping resources that others might want to control. "There's more," Thomas said from the far corner of the room. He was holding what looked like a strong box, its metal surface green with age but still solid. This was hidden behind the medical books. "Weighs a fair amount." He set the box on the table beside the map, and Clara could see that it was secured with a complex lock that looked far more sophisticated than anything a simple homesteader would normally own. "Can you open it?" she asked. Thomas examined the lock, running his fingers over the mechanism. "Maybe, but it'll take some doing. This isn't a standard frontier lock. This is the kind of thing you'd see on a bank vault or a government office." Dr. Matthews had continued examining the medical texts, and his expression was growing increasingly puzzled. "Clara, what did Mrs. Hartwell tell you about her background? Her family, her education?" "Not much," Clara admitted. "She always said the past was better left buried, that what mattered was the life you built for yourself. I knew she'd been married young to Mr. Hartwell and that he'd died in an accident when she was still in her 20s, but beyond that." She shrugged helplessly. "Well, judging from these books and papers, your Mrs. Hartwell was a remarkably educated woman. These medical texts alone represent years of study, and some of these other volumes." He gestured at the shelves. "Philosophy, law, advanced mathematics, geological surveys. This is the library of someone with serious intellectual pursuits." Sheriff Morrison was studying the map more closely, tracing the marked locations with his finger. "These mining claims, some of them are on properties that have changed hands recently. Properties where the original owners sold out for much less than the claims were worth." He looked up at Clara with a grave expression. What if Mrs. Hartwell wasn't just collecting information? What if she was documenting a pattern of fraud and exploitation? The pieces were starting to fit together in Clara's mind, creating a picture that was both magnificent and terrifying. Mrs. Hartwell hadn't just been hiding books from a disapproving father. She'd been building a comprehensive record of corruption and illegal activity throughout the territory, documenting the systematic theft of valuable resources from unsuspecting settlers. That would explain why Dr. Blackwood is so interested in getting his hands on this room, Thomas said grimly. If Mrs. Hartwell had evidence of widespread fraud, it could bring down some very powerful people, Sheriff Morrison finished. People with enough money and influence to hire armed men and forge legal documents. Clara sank into the room's single chair, overwhelmed by the implications. The woman who'd raised her, who'd taught her to embroider and tend chickens and read Bible verses, had apparently been conducting a secret investigation that could expose corruption on a territorial scale. No wonder she'd been so secretive about her past, so insistent on keeping certain things hidden. "We need to get this box open," she said firmly. "Whatever Mrs. Hartwell was protecting, whatever evidence she gathered, it needs to see the light of day. She spent 50 years collecting this information. We can't let it fall into the hands of the people she was investigating." Thomas nodded agreement. "I can work on the lock, but it might take time. And we need to assume that Dr. Blackwood and his men will be back, probably with reinforcements." Then we'd better be ready for them, Sheriff Morrison said. Sam, can you organize shifts to keep watch on this place? And Dr. Matthews, I'd like you to start going through these medical texts, see if you can figure out exactly what kind of doctor this Blackwood character is supposed to be. As the men began organizing their defense of the homestead, Clara remained in the hidden room, looking at the accumulated treasures of Mrs. Hartwell's secret life. Books and maps, documents and instruments, all carefully preserved and protected. But more than that, she was looking at evidence of a woman who'd refused to be silenced, who'd used her mind and her determination to fight injustice even when she had to do it in secret. The men outside were making plans to protect Mrs. Hartwell's legacy, but Clara was beginning to understand that the real protection had to come from somewhere else. The evidence in this room needed to be shared, published, brought before the proper authorities. Only by exposing the truth could they ensure that Mrs. Hartwell's work wouldn't be buried again. As the afternoon sun slanted through the doorway, casting long shadows across the hidden treasures, Clara made a decision that would change everything. She was going to make sure the world knew what Mrs. Hartwell had discovered, no matter how dangerous that knowledge might be. The locked room had held its secrets for 50 years, but its time of hiding was finally over. The strongbox proved more stubborn than Thomas had anticipated. 3 days passed while he worked on the lock, his tools spread across Mrs. Hartwell's kitchen table as Clara and a rotating guard of neighbors kept watch for any sign of Dr. Blackwood's return. The homestead had taken on the atmosphere of a fortress, with men posted at strategic points around the property and the women from town bringing meals and supplies to sustain the vigil. Clara found herself moving between roles she'd never expected to fill: quartermaster for a small army, keeper of Mrs. Hartwell's secrets, and something approaching a partner to Thomas as they worked together to understand what they'd uncovered. The easy cooperation that had developed between them felt natural as breathing, and she caught herself wondering what it might be like to make such partnership permanent. "Try this one," she suggested, handing Thomas a thin metal tool she'd found in Mrs. Hartwell's sewing kit. She used to say there wasn't a lock made that couldn't be opened if you understood how it thought. Thomas accepted the tool with a smile that had become familiar and comforting over the past few days. "She sounds like she was quite a woman. Wish I could have known her better." "She would have liked you," Clara said, settling into the chair beside him. "She always said the measure of a man was what he was willing to fight for, and you've been fighting for her memory since the day we met." The lock mechanism clicked softly, and Thomas's face lit up with satisfaction. "There we are. Mrs. Hartwell's sewing skills just saved the day." Inside the strongbox, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture and time, were documents that made everything they'd discovered so far seem like mere preparation. Maps with mineral surveys marked in careful detail, correspondence between territorial officials and mining companies, and most damning of all, a ledger that tracked payments made to judges, sheriffs, and county clerks throughout Colorado Territory. "Sweet Lord," Thomas breathed, scanning a letter that bore the official seal of the territorial government. "Clara, look at this. This is correspondence from the territorial secretary's office, but it's not about legitimate government business. They're coordinating the seizure of property from homesteaders who don't know the value of what they're sitting on." Clara read over his shoulder, her anger growing with each line. The letter detailed a systematic plan to use fraudulent debt claims, forged documents, and corrupt legal proceedings to transfer valuable mining and water rights from small farmers to a consortium of investors. Mrs. Hartwell had somehow obtained copies of the actual planning documents, proof that the thefts weren't random crimes but part of an organized conspiracy. "This Dr. Blackwood," Clara said, pointing to a name that appeared repeatedly in the correspondence. "He's not just some corrupt physician. According to this, he's the territorial coordinator for the whole operation. He travels from county to county, identifying valuable properties and arranging for their legal seizure." Thomas was examining the mineral surveys, comparing them to the property markers on Mrs. Hartwell's maps. "No wonder they want this information so badly. According to these surveys, There's a significant silver vein that runs right under this property and 3 of the neighboring homesteads. If word got out about that, every homesteader in the territory would want to know if their land had been surveyed without their knowledge, Clara finished. And every family that's been forced to sell for fraudulent debts would have grounds to demand their property back. The kitchen door opened, and Sheriff Morrison entered with Dr. Matthews and Sam Morrison close behind. The 3 men had been coordinating the defense of the property, but from their expressions, Clara could tell they brought news that wasn't entirely welcome. "We've got a problem," Sheriff Morrison said without preamble. "Word came from town this morning. Dr. Blackwood himself arrived yesterday with a federal marshal and a court order. They're claiming jurisdiction over this property based on territorial mining rights." Clara felt her heart sink. "Can they do that?" "If the paperwork's legitimate, yes," the sheriff admitted. "Federal mining law supersedes local property rights when significant mineral deposits are involved. But we don't think the paperwork is legitimate," Dr. Matthews interrupted. "I sent a telegram to the territorial capital yesterday, asking about this Dr. Blackwood's credentials. Got an interesting reply this morning." He pulled a telegram from his pocket and read aloud, "No physician named Blackwood licensed in Colorado Territory. No federal mining survey authorized for your county. Suggest extreme caution regarding any claims of federal authority. Investigation being initiated." Thomas looked up from the documents spread across the table. "So he's operating completely outside the law, but with enough official-looking paperwork to fool most local authorities." "That's about the size of it," Sheriff Morrison agreed. "Question is, what do we do about it? He's got that federal marshal with him, and even if the marshal's been fooled by forged documents, he still carries federal authority. I can't just arrest a federal officer without causing a political incident that could reach all the way to Washington." Clara stood up, her mind racing. The answer seemed obvious to her, though she wasn't sure the men would like it. "We don't try to fight the federal marshal. We give him the truth." "What do you mean?" Sam Morrison asked. "I mean we show him exactly what Mrs. Hartwell discovered. We lay out all the evidence. The forged documents, the systematic fraud, the conspiracy to steal territorial resources. If he's an honest federal officer who's been deceived by Dr. Blackwood, he'll want to see justice done. And if he's part of the conspiracy?" She shrugged. "Well, at least we'll know what we're really fighting." Thomas nodded slowly. "It's risky, but it might be our best chance. If we can convince the federal marshal that he's been used as a pawn in an illegal scheme, he might help us instead of hindering us." "And if we can't convince him?" Sheriff Morrison asked. Clara looked around the kitchen where she'd shared so many meals with Mrs. Hartwell, where she'd learned to read and write and think for herself. The woman who'd raised her had spent 50 years fighting corruption and injustice, often at great personal risk. Now it was Clara's turn to decide how much she was willing to sacrifice for what was right. "Then we fight," she said simply. "Mrs. Hartwell didn't collect all this evidence just to have it buried again when the stakes got high. If the federal government has been corrupted, then the people need to know about it." Before anyone could respond, the sound of hoofbeats came from the direction of the main road. A lot of hoofbeats, moving with the steady rhythm of an organized column rather than the hasty gallop of men fleeing or attacking. "That'll be them," Sheriff Morrison said, moving to the window. "Looks like about a dozen riders. Dr. Blackwood's not taking any chances this time." Clara felt her pulse quicken, but alongside the fear was something else, a sense of anticipation that surprised her. 4 days she'd been waiting for this confrontation, wondering how it would unfold. Now that the moment had arrived, she felt ready for it. "Thomas," she said, gathering the most important documents from the table. "Help me get these organized. If we're going to present evidence to a federal marshal, we need to do it right." The riders approached the house in formation, and Clara could see why Dr. Blackwood had been able to intimidate so many people. The man at the head of the column wore expensive clothes and carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Beside him rode a man in a dark uniform who could only be the federal marshal, and behind them came 10 armed men who looked like they'd be equally comfortable robbing banks or enforcing corrupt court orders. "Dr. Blackwood, I presume," Thomas said, watching the man dismount with theatrical flourish. "Indeed." Dr. Blackwood's voice carried the educated accent of someone who'd received formal schooling back east, but there was something oily about his manner that made Clara's skin crawl. "And you must be the troublemakers who've been interfering with legitimate legal proceedings." The federal marshal stepped forward, a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes. "I'm Marshal Davidson, and I have here a federal court order authorizing the seizure of this property and all contents therein for investigation of territorial mining violations. I'll need everyone to step away from the house while my men conduct their search." Clara exchanged glances with Thomas, then stepped forward with the documents clutched in her hands. "Marshal Davidson, before you begin your search, there's something you need to see. Evidence that Dr. Blackwood and his associates have been conducting an illegal conspiracy to defraud homesteaders throughout the territory." Dr. Blackwood's face darkened. "Marshal, this woman has no legal standing here. She's merely a former servant of the deceased, and her claims have no merit." "Maybe so," Marshal Davidson said, "but I'd like to hear what she has to say. In my experience, people don't usually organize armed resistance unless they believe they're fighting for something important." Clara felt a surge of hope. The marshal seemed genuinely interested in the truth, which suggested he might indeed be an honest officer who'd been deceived rather than a willing participant in corruption. "Marshal," she began, spreading Mrs. Hartwell's map on the porch table where everyone could see it. "This is a survey of mineral deposits throughout Colorado Territory, compiled over the past 50 years by the woman who lived here. And this," she held up the ledger, "is a record of bribes paid to territorial officials to facilitate the illegal seizure of properties sitting on valuable mineral deposits." Marshal Davidson examined the documents with growing interest, his trained eye quickly recognizing their significance. "Where did these come from?" Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell collected them over decades of careful investigation. She discovered that homesteaders were being systematically defrauded through forged debt claims and corrupt legal proceedings, all coordinated by Dr. Blackwood and his associates. "That's preposterous," Dr. Blackwood sputtered. The woman was clearly delusional, probably suffering from senile dementia. "These documents are obviously fabrications." But Marshal Davidson was studying the territorial seal on one of the letters, comparing it to official documents from his own files. "This seal looks authentic to me. And the paper stock matches what the territorial government uses for official correspondence." He looked up at Dr. Blackwood with sharp eyes. "Doctor, I'm going to need to see your federal credentials. The original documents, not copies." For the first time since his arrival, Dr. Blackwood looked uncertain. "Marshal, surely you're not going to waste time on the fantasies of a dead woman and her servant girl? We have important work to do here." "The credentials, Doctor." "Now." Dr. Blackwood reached into his coat, but instead of producing documents, his hand emerged holding a small pistol. Around the yard, his men began reaching for their own weapons, clearly prepared for this possibility. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Marshal," Dr. Blackwood said, his cultured voice turning cold as winter wind. "You've seen too much, and Miss Whitmore has been far too clever for her own good. This was supposed to be a simple property seizure, but it's become something much more complicated." Clara felt Thomas tense beside her, his hand moving toward his gun. Around the yard, Sheriff Morrison and his men were doing the same, but they were outnumbered and caught in the open. The situation was about to explode into violence. But Marshal Davidson didn't reach for his weapon. Instead, he smiled, a thin, satisfied expression that suggested he'd been expecting this development. "You know, Doctor," he said conversationally, I've been investigating reports of territorial corruption for the past 6 months. Mysterious federal mining surveys that nobody authorized, homesteaders being forced off valuable land through fraudulent legal proceedings, corrupt officials suddenly acquiring expensive property on territorial salaries. I was beginning to think I'd never catch the people responsible in the act. Dr. Blackwood's face went pale. You knew. I suspected. But now, thanks to Miss Whitmore's evidence and your own confession, I know. The marshal's voice hardened. Doctor, you and your associates are under federal arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States government, corruption of territorial officials, and violation of federal mining law. The standoff that followed lasted only seconds. Dr. Blackwood raised his pistol toward the marshal, but Thomas was faster, his shot taking the corrupt doctor in the shoulder and spinning him around. Sheriff Morrison and his men moved with practiced efficiency, disarming Dr. Blackwood's associates before they could mount effective resistance. When the dust settled, Dr. Blackwood sat slumped against the porch railing, clutching his wounded shoulder and staring at Clara with undisguised hatred. You have no idea what you've done, he snarled. This conspiracy reaches higher than you can imagine. Arresting me won't stop it. Maybe not, Marshal Davidson said, kneeling to examine the wounded man. But it's a start. And with Mrs. Hartwell's evidence, we'll be able to trace the whole network. He looked up at Clara with something approaching admiration. Miss Whitmore, your friend was quite a remarkable woman. This information could help us recover millions of dollars in stolen property and put dozens of corrupt officials behind bars. Clara felt tears threaten as the full magnitude of Mrs. Hartwell's achievement began to sink in. For 50 years, the woman had fought injustice in secret, building a case that could bring down an entire criminal conspiracy. She'd never lived to see her work vindicated, but her careful documentation was about to expose corruption on a scale that reached from local courthouses to territorial capitals. There's something else, Thomas said, producing the strongbox from inside the house. Mrs. Hartwell left instructions, sealed with the lock. She wanted her evidence to be published in newspapers throughout the territory, made available to every homesteader who might be at risk. Marshal Davidson examined the instructions, written in Mrs. Hartwell's careful hand and dated just weeks before her death. She knew she was dying, he realized. She was making sure her work would continue even after she was gone. Clara nodded, understanding finally why Mrs. Hartwell had been so insistent about keeping certain things private during her lifetime. She hadn't been hiding from shame or embarrassment. She'd been protecting an investigation that could have gotten her killed if the wrong people had discovered it. We'll honor her wishes, the marshal promised. This evidence will be shared with every newspaper in Colorado Territory, and copies will go to the federal authorities in Washington. The people she was trying to protect will know what she sacrificed for them. As Dr. Blackwood and his associates were loaded into a wagon for transport to the territorial jail, Clara found herself standing in the yard where this whole adventure had begun. The auction that had threatened to scatter Mrs. Hartwell's belongings to strangers had instead led to the discovery of a hidden legacy that would protect countless families from fraud and corruption. So what happens now? She asked Thomas, who was helping Sheriff Morrison secure the prisoners. Now we rebuild, he said, moving to stand beside her. The property will stay in your hands. Marshal Davidson confirmed that all of Dr. Blackwood's claims were fraudulent. And if you're still willing to have a partner in fixing up this place. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest, pushing away the last of the fear and uncertainty that had plagued her for weeks. I think Mrs. Hartwell would approve of that arrangement. She always said a homestead worked best when it had people who loved it. And do you? Thomas asked softly. Love it, I mean? Clara looked around at the property where she'd grown up, where she'd learned to read and think and stand up for herself. Where Mrs. Hartwell had conducted her secret investigation and built a hidden library filled with dreams and evidence. Where neighbors had rallied to protect something they valued and where truth had finally triumphed over corruption. Yes, she said simply. I love it. And I love the idea of building something new here, something that honors what Mrs. Hartwell fought for. Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. Then let's get started. We've got a house to fix up, land to work, and a legacy to maintain. Mrs. Hartwell's room can stay exactly as it is. A library and archive for anyone who wants to understand how one determined woman changed the course of territorial history. As the sun set behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara stood with Thomas on the porch of the house that would be their home. Around them, neighbors were beginning to pack up and return to their own properties, the crisis finally over. But the bonds that had been forged during the confrontation would endure, creating a network of mutual support that would strengthen the entire community. Inside the house, Mrs. Hartwell's hidden room waited to become something new, no longer a secret sanctuary, but a monument to the power of knowledge and determination. The books and documents that had been hidden for 50 years would now be available to scholars and researchers, ensuring that the lessons Mrs. Hartwell had learned would benefit future generations. The locked room had finally given up its secrets, but in doing so, it had opened doors to possibilities that Clara had never imagined. A new life, a true partnership, and the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. Mrs. Hartwell's legacy was secure, and the future stretched ahead like an open book, waiting to be filled with new stories of courage and hope. Winter was coming to Colorado territory, but for the first time in months, Clara wasn't afraid of the cold. She had Thomas beside her, friends around her, and a purpose that extended far beyond mere survival. Mrs. Hartwell had taught her to read and write and think for herself. Now Clara would use those skills to help build the kind of community where knowledge was valued, corruption was exposed, and people protected each other against those who would exploit the vulnerable. The homestead had survived its greatest trial, and in the process, it had become something more than just a place to live. It had become a symbol of resistance against injustice, a testament to the power of one woman's determination to fight for what was right. And as Clara and Thomas began planning their life together, they knew they were building on foundations that had been laid by someone who understood the true meaning of courage. The mystery of the locked room was solved, but the story it had set in motion was just beginning. And for Clara Whitmore, soon to be Clara Seaton, that story promised to be filled with the kind of love and purpose that Mrs. Hartwell had always said made life worth living.